Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm inspired to look out over the sea of faces after spending a day on a beautiful college campus. I think there's nothing better to do in the month of October than to walk across a college campus and crunch those leaves under your feet and smell the air and look around at all those very, very young people. They get younger every year, and since I'm no longer on a college campus, it's very inspiring to be back. And so thank you for this opportunity to be among you tonight. If anyone would have told me as a young child growing up on a dairy farm about 20 miles from here that I would someday be a college president, I would have asked, what's a college? What's a president? As a teenager, I would have known the meaning of the words, but my eye then was focused on becoming what I thought was the highest pinnacle, a high school teacher. And I still think it's a high pinnacle, by the way. I would have known what the words meant by then, but I would have brushed off the idea as all but impossible. How then did it happen that a little girl who preached to her dolls and her stuffed animals, who acted out the stories in the books she read, who practiced hitting in the meadow until she could loft the ball over the creek, a girl who looked like this at the age of 12 and joined the church wearing a covering on her head all the way through Warwick High School. How did she become a college president? Sometimes at talks I give, someone asks me straight out, so, what did you do to become a college president? The truth is, there are many ways to answer that question. But I've noticed one thing in exchanges with people who ask it, and especially in Mennonite settings. When I say, I never applied for the job, I see the face just visibly relaxes. And then a smile or a nod appears. Okay, all right. Well, the truth is that most college presidents never applied for their jobs. They are called to the presidency because someone, and hopefully many people, detected gifts of leadership in them. When this happens to men, we consider it normal. With women, there's still a little difference. No wonder that when Mennonite women leaders tell their stories, they seldom focus on anything they did to lean in to leadership, and instead focus on God's calling and on the community's call. None of us want to appear ambitious or, worse, arrogant. No doubt, all of us carry some unexamined assumptions about both leadership and women. And for me, that's why I wrote a memoir. I wanted to excavate my own answer to this and other questions, not in a theoretical way about leadership or about women's roles or anything like that, but in a personal way. I wanted to know what kind of shape God chose in making me. And I wanted to learn, how did I feel God's hand continuing to shape and guide me? I wanted to examine mistakes I made and lessons I learned from both failure and successes. I wanted to see the foundation of support which held me up in hard times and made sure I didn't get the big head in good times. I wanted to write stories out of a place of gratitude for the many gifts I have been given, and to challenge myself to use my talent, my experience, now in this last third of my life, for the sake of helping other people see value in their stories. I especially wrote for my own grandchildren. I held my grandson Owen in my arms in the mornings as I wrote this book, and in the afternoons, I penned the stories that you read now. And even though she wasn't born yet when I was writing these stories, I wrote 2 for my granddaughter, Julia, who's almost 2 years old now. A few words about memoir as a genre of writing. Memoirs of the past were written, or sometimes ghostwritten, often ghostwritten, by presidents, kings, generals, and usually men. When people read about the lives of the rich and the famous, they looked for the secrets of success, and often these books are most enjoyed when they dish on the enemy. And you can learn all about the conflicts in somebody's life and they have triumphantly overcome. I didn't want to write that kind of story. It did not fit either my own perception of my life, or certainly it didn't fit what the Mennonite community expects of its members, especially of its women. I knew instinctively that the biggest danger of writing a memoir, even when focused on childhood rather than adulthood, was pride, either the reality of it or the perception of it. Later, that suspicion was confirmed when one person who attended my talk at Goshen College came as a skeptic and told me that if I had written a memoir about my rise to power, she would not have bought the book. But after hearing me talk about why I really wrote this book, she was eager to read it, and she even wants to give it as Christmas presents. In our time, memoir has become more democratic. We still have best-selling political and celebrity memoirs, and we also have stories about a new kind of memoir, about people who grew up in poverty and became writers despite abuse, horrific living conditions, and many dangers. Angela's Ashes, The Glass Castle, and The Liars Club, just to name a few famous memoirs of the new type in the 21st century. These make riveting stories because they contain all the elements that keep readers turning the page. They are more fascinating often than a novel. And nonfiction can be even more amazing than fiction in some of these lives. How will the protagonist survive, change, grow, and overcome all of these perils? Next to such enthralling stories, my memoir looks like an Amish buggy being passed by a Maserati. My story is a slow one, but it is not without its own drama. For example, here's a little story, just a little one, from Blush, that was actually a turning point in my path to leadership. It happened in a rather unlikely place, a tobacco patch. And here's the story from the book. My family grew about 10 acres of tobacco as our main cash crop. One summer day in 1961, we were whacking out weeds while the sun was frying all living things. I could actually see heat waves forming a mirage in front of me. "Look at this big fella," my father said. Dangling from his hand was the plumpest, neon green tobacco worm I had ever seen. As it writhed in my daddy's hand, I felt the little hairs in the back of my neck stand up, and I made a face. I could tell that Daddy was expecting more of a reaction. So I pretended to take a scientific interest in the little black worm, little green worm, looking at the black tentacles under the bright green body. Daddy looked at me, observing the worm so cool and calm. Then he did something rare. He spoke recklessly. "I'll give you $5 if you bite this worm in two," he said. Daddy did not go around doling out $5 bills. And the worm dangling from his outstretched hand that afternoon suddenly became as treacherous and tantalizing as a snake in the garden. My 10-year-old brother's mouth hung open and my mother clutched her hoe. It was time to be the eldest daughter of the eldest son. I took the worm from Daddy's hand. I held it up in the sun as if blessing it. Then I took it into my mouth, biting down hard and fast, spitting almost before the green hit my teeth. I gagged and spit, jumping around for my brother, trying to give everyone enough entertainment for such a high price of admission. Daddy said nothing, but he reached in his pocket and pulled out his dilapidated wallet. He extracted his one and only $5 bill and gave it to me. I tucked it in my bra. I knew I had risen to the task. The taste in my mouth was sour. The taste in my heart was sweet. So, how does an event as small as this one, something that took 5 minutes in a tobacco patch, how does such a small event loom so large in the life of a Mennonite girl in the 1960s? Why did this 5-minute drama come back to me? And conversely, why did I completely forget to tell the near-death experience of driving our farm mall into the barn door at age 10? A story that does not appear in this book. What is it about certain stories that stick and teach us, and we remember almost as though they changed us, and whereas other more dramatic stories disappear? For most of us, turning points, times when we passed or failed tests of endurance, bravery, or confidence are more dramatic internally than externally. If we can listen to the emotional truth of our past, we can also gain courage to face the challenges of the present and the future, and we can help others do the same. That's why I write. It can take a long time for these emotional truths to surface. For me, it took years. After drafting and editing the whole book several times, I sat down on my red chair and wrote this confession, words that now stand at the very beginning of my book. Ever since I was little, I wanted to be big. Not just big as in tall, but big as in important, successful, influential. I wanted to be seen and listened to. I wanted to make a splash in the world. I wrote those words and tears came to my eyes. And I knew I had found the thing I was ready to confess and to write. I named the very thing I feared most, exposing my ambition and naming it. Now I could search for ways I was led into deeper and deeper awareness of what it meant to be big, how God used that desire to keep teaching me. I could look at every turning point in my life as one of the challenges to that idea. I named the fact that I wasn't born humble. Few people are. The shape God had in mind for my soul was aspirational and exuberant. Yes, it was even ambitious in a very hazy way. My goal was to be seen and heard. It was there from day one. that desire could lead me into good or into evil. Which would it be? Sheryl Sandberg, the author of a recent book about women's leadership called Lean In, describes the path women take to leadership as more like climbing a jungle gym than a ladder, moving from side to side, eventually moving up, but being on a jungle gym rather than this idea of shooting straight up some ladder. She also encourages women not to hang back, but to sit at the table. Ever since I left the bluebird circle in my own in order to sit in the redbird circle in 2nd grade, I've claimed a seat at the table. She asked this question also: what would you do if you weren't afraid? And that led me to think about my own life and the many ways in which I haven't been afraid, because I have had the wonderful surrounding impact of a loving family and a loving church around me. But it's also true that I've done a lot of things, including accepting the job of being college president while I was afraid. Along the way, I learned that I could admit vulnerability and actually become stronger by being vulnerable. It's always fascinated me, for example, that Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, was being pushed by her campaign manager to always be the commander-in-chief and really prove that a woman can be strong and lead. And when she did that, I didn't like her very much. And a lot of other people didn't either. But on that one moment, unscripted moment, when another woman asked her what it was like to be hounded or to be whatever she was experiencing as stressful at the time, and tears welled up in her eyes, and she told the truth about how she really felt, all of a sudden, lots of people felt much more sympathetic toward her. And I think all people need to learn this, but women especially, because sometimes women who are asked to lead need to feel, or want to feel and project an image of strength that may or may not be actually who they are and what they're feeling. I'm not obviously talking about being unwilling to lead and to appear to be strong, but I'm talking about being honest and having integrity and authenticity. We create the stories of our lives, both in the living of them and in reflecting on them in a particular context. Tonight, I want to honor my context, the Mennonite community, and the role it has played in helping me become the person I am today, both a leader and a follower, a person who has been seen and heard, and a person now well aware of entering the last stage in my exciting journey in life. I've chosen to do so by focusing on 3 women. The woman in this picture is the woman I want to honor tonight and to tell you about tonight. This is Mary Lawver, and her husband Melvin was the pastor of Lidditz Mennonite Church when I was growing up. And Mary, the minister's wife, is to all appearances a good Mennonite woman who fully participated in the role of wife to the minister, but also in many ways carved out a new role for herself in the congregation. And as I look back, it seems like she was almost a co-pastor before the church allowed that role. She was not a biological mother herself, and therefore, the lucky children of her congregation got to be her children. And she poured her love and attention into us She poured her artistic energy into spaces that she created for herself by making ceramics, by making beautiful things out of found objects. She made her own stationery, as we're going to see in a minute. She also was able to give talks and to inspire many other women to live up to their God-given potential and to see themselves as children of God, able to offer their gifts. This is one thank you note, and this is 1/3 of one thank you note. My brother and I received this note. Why? Because our names were on a note when my parents gave corn and bologna to the minister and wife. Remember, in these days, there wasn't a salaried ministry. And so you gave things that you had to show your appreciation, but this was in lieu of salary, and it was amazing to me as an adult looking back on this note to see the care and attention. What this is it's a children's book. This is an illustrated children's book. And she tells the story of what happened to the corn and the bologna. This letter is one I'm writing to tell you about some ears of corn, there's the picture, and a pack of delicious bologna. Once upon a time, some ears of corn and a pack of homemade bologna went along with some people to church. Instead of going inside the church, there's a picture of Lidditz Mennonite Church, almost like it looks on the outside. This corn and bologna stayed outside and somehow found its way to another car owned by the pastor. Now it so happened that on this very day, the pastor and his wife were planning to leave on a business trip. Now, I could read you the whole thing, but I think you get the picture. And I am sure that we are not the only children in the congregation who received notes like this. It must have taken well over an hour and lots of imagination to write a story like this. And when you as a child receive a note like this, and when you on a weekly basis are patted and touched and acknowledged and your eyes are met, you are seen and you are heard, and you feel the love of the church through the minister's wife. It also happened, as I'm looking back now, that Mary chastised me. Overtly once, and then kind of secondarily another time. She had a kids club, a craft club that she invited us to on Saturday afternoons, and about 20 young girls, 10 to 13 years old, were arrayed with their popsicle sticks or whatever we were making at the time, and she observed that I needed some more glue on my end of the table. And so I saw there was a pot of glue here, and I came over here and talked to the person who was closest to the pot of glue. And I said, could we trade something or other? And I took the pot of glue and took it down to this end of the table. Mary saw this, and she chastised me. And she said, "You can't make deals for the whole table. There's more than you and this other one girl here. You have to be considerate of those around you. You have to, it's not just what you want, it's what they want too." And I felt really bad, but she was right. I hadn't paid enough attention to the other girls. Then later on, when she asked me to come pick out a gift of the ceramic objects, and I picked I picked a tiered hors d'oeuvre thing made out of ceramics. And she said, "Now you can pick. Do you want 2 layers or 3? And I said, "Of course, 3. And she said, "I thought you'd say that." She taught me some things. And she helped me to know that aspiration is good, but be aware. Be aware of what it means to other people. This is the Hershey family, 1965. All of us in our family benefited from growing up in Lidditz Mennonite Church. And this is our only family picture, I think, taken before I left home. Every member of my family hates this picture, as well as loves it. We all have backstories. There's a bee sting. There's a bad hair day. There's a funny posture. There's recoveries from surgery. And then there's just the general hubbub of getting 7 people ready to go anywhere while sharing one bathroom. Now, there are 2 other people who are on that picture in this room tonight. I'm going to ask my sister Doris and my mother, Barbara Ann, to be acknowledged. I'm so glad they're here tonight. And I want to acknowledge how much I learned about leadership from all of the members of my family. And I particularly want to pay tribute to my mother and to the values that I learned in my home. And if you are going to list things that leaders need to learn, I think I could make a wonderful list from the Hershey family. Work hard. Always give a baker's dozen when making a sale, and more than what you are paid when you go to work. Tell the truth. Seek out inspiring stories and tell your own. Spend a lot of time on mother's lap listening to her read, and then read to each other and read for your own pleasure and edification. Share. Don't hit. Fight fair and then make up. Say you're sorry when you hurt someone. When one of you hurts, all of you help. And we will all die. Like our sister Mary Louise, who is not on this picture, who died after 39 days of being alive. So, make this one life count. My mother, in case you got us confused, this is the mother. When I look at this picture, I'm really amused because the photographer, for some reason, didn't put all the children around the 2 parents, but rather had me sit in the middle of this. And so and I'm actually dressed more conservatively than my mother. So I just kind of find it interesting that what you see in a picture that you didn't see necessarily when it was taken in the first place. And now, a tribute to 2 other women in my life, or 2 women in my life, starting with my grandmother, Anna Mary Herr, age 17. The thing you will notice on these photos is that each of the women, separated by however many years old she was when she had her daughter, she herself is 17 on this picture. So we're going to see 3 generations of women in age 17. My grandmother first, my mother second. I call her the Barbara Stanwyck picture. And here I am, age 17. If you know anything about the history of Mennonites and dress in this time period, you'll know that there's just some really interesting things going on in this photo, these photos, in that I'm the only one wearing a covering. The other 2 are wearing jewelry, probably some makeup, and have beautiful dresses that show that they enjoy being young, being fancy, and that you would be hard-pressed to tell that they were Mennonite until you come to this picture. And then you would have to know lots of other things in order to understand this. So I'm not going to go into all the details, but I will say that I didn't even ever think of this until I wrote a memoir, until I actually put those pictures side by side. And then imagine what difference this made, that this is the way I looked, this was the way they looked. So I also noticed something else when I was studying the genealogy of my female line, and that is that until I was age 6, I was the only daughter of an only daughter. These two were only daughters, my grandmother and my mother, and until I was age 6, I was an only daughter. And so there was this amazing concentration of female maternal energy that I was the recipient of just by order of my birth. And nobody was saying these things, but again, highly unusual for farm families to have only one daughter, and for it to happen in multiple generations. And you know, what difference did that make? I'm not quite sure, but I find it interesting, and I think it did matter. I think I felt a lot of those previous generations of desires and of loving attention. I guess that the question would be, since I was the one who went to a public high school with a covering on my head during those years, what was it that I learned about leadership? Well, if I had to boil it down to one thing, I would go to Romans 12:2. Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That idea of being non-conformed sunk deep into my soul, and I think it's really important that leaders learn that. Because otherwise, we're just formed into the shape that others want us to be in. And the idea that of not being conformed to this world was a great gift that I got from that experience of being visibly Mennonite during the most pure conscious years of my life. So, was it a good thing for a little girl in her strange jungle gym path to becoming a woman leader to have grown up Mennonite? I have to say that it was. It gave me role models for how to climb, as I have already talked about. It gave me some people who were really creative for whatever amount of space they had to work in, to just expand it a little bit and to show all that it could contain. Even if it was set aside as woman's work, there could be a lot of value and a lot of creativity in that. Certainly, I learned that from the women I have shown you. It also gave me the ultimate role model for Christian leadership, Jesus, and his friends, Mary and Martha, both of whom instructed me. These were two women who definitely claimed seats at the table. It allowed me ultimately to see my real self as aspirational and to teach me slowly the virtue of humility, a virtue indispensable to good leadership and not one highly valued in American culture at large. And so it was a wonderful training ground. In the end, of course, we know that we are all headed to more important questions than how high we rose in any organizational ladder. And we all know that no one says, I wish I had spent more time in the office, or I wish I had gained more medals on their deathbed. And now I still have a leadership goal. My mission is to prepare for the hour of my own death, one good day at a time, and to help others do the same. As for becoming big, this slide was taken from the meadow of Silver Summit Farm about 1965. And I learned maybe 20 years ago the meaning of my own name, something I didn't know about myself. But Shirley means, it's Shirley, from the bright meadow. It's an English name. It's a place name. And since this meadow, which is actually where the photographer is standing, and there's a big meadow here, there's a creek, and then there's a hill here. This is where I played with my brothers and sisters. Here I walked along the woods to call the cows home. Here I admired the lovely droop of the weeping willow trees. Here above lie the graves of my Snyder ancestors. And I hope here will I be buried. As for becoming big, there's nothing bigger than returning to our Creator through the path laid out for us by Jesus Christ. So, here is my final meditation on what it means to be big from the conclusion of Blush. I've had a lot of what the glittering world calls success, and I'm grateful for my opportunities to be a leader. But I would not be my ancestors' daughter if I didn't know that the grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever. Thank you.
Let's take a few minutes for questions and discussion. Feel free to ask Shirley, and she'll engage as you have questions or comments.
This is the fun part, so. Yes.
Maybe this is an inducement to buy the book and read it, but why is it entitled Blush? I think I have an idea, but could you clarify?
Well, what's your idea?
You were taught to blush because you wanted to be seen.
Well, you're getting close. You know that it's connected to that beginning, and you're right. The working title for this book was Rosy Cheeks. And the reason I named it Rosy Cheeks is that I had a teacher who gave me that as a nickname. The teacher happens to be here tonight. And I'd like to acknowledge Miss Joan Reel, who I saw in the audience halfway through this. And that nickname I knew was getting me close to something, but it didn't seem like it was quite the right word yet. I was hoping I could find one word rather than two, and I didn't want something quite so personal as a nickname to be the title because I wanted it to be something that both related to my life, but is universal. And the experience of blushing, which I did a lot of when I was in my teen years, and where I had naturally rosy cheeks that have all these positive connotations of, being fresh air and being from a farm and being healthy and all of that. But they also, they're beyond your control, for one thing. That is the most irritating thing of all, to be feeling this hot flush of blood in your face. And it gives you away. You're trying to be sophisticated, and really, the story is of having one foot in the Mennonite world and another foot in a public high school in the 1960s. 1960s. When the whole world is in this revolutionary upheaval, and I'm trying to figure out how to navigate education, culture, pop culture especially, courtship and all the hormones that go with this time, and also the teachings that I'm getting from my community and my church. And so blushing was, it works symbolically to help understand what it's like to stand in this position of tension, where you can't always control whether your feelings will show up on your face or not. And mine showed up on my face pretty often. And so this title and the introduction then led to a theme that I could work throughout the rest of the book. and show how along with the theme of being big, whenever I was aspiring to be too big and too glittering was usually when I ended up blushing, because I often didn't know at all what I was trying to do. But when I learned to be more authentic, more natural, and I found that I was blushing less. And it doesn't mean that I never blush now, because I still do. But the teenage years were definitely the years when I considered blushing a plague. And now they can serve as a symbol for the experience of growing up Mennonite in my context.
Sure. In those years, a lot of Mennonites went to LMH.
Yes.
Was that
Well, you know, a lot of people ask me that because I could have felt much less tension if I had gone to LMH. I would have had to dress even more conservatively.
What is LMH?
Lancaster Mennonite High School, which at the time, do not think of the current high school if you have no reference points, because when we're talking about are the years 1960 to 1966, and the high school had very strict dress rules, especially for girls, and I wasn't too attracted to that. But it wasn't the only reason I didn't go there. I think some of the other reasons, I don't know, we didn't have that many people in our church that went there. It was pretty far away from Lidditz, and especially north of Lidditz. I would have had to drive, and the highways are dangerous, and it cost money. So those were probably the reasons that I didn't go. My mother is nodding her head. And furthermore, I really liked Warwick High School. I had good teachers. I had a good time with the fellow students. And despite the fact that I didn't always feel comfortable in that setting, that's where I went to school, and that was my reality. But it would have been I would have a very different story to tell. If I had gone to Lancaster Mennonite, I would have looked plainer than this. I would have had to wear, here I'm not wearing a cape dress, I'm wearing a sweater, but I would have dressed much more conservatively if I had gone there. And although that school was changing too. The church was changing, the school was changing, but I was right at the end before it really changed. In the years, and this is another thing I learned, that the particular years that I happened to be in high school were the last years of the Lancaster Conference rules dictating uniform plain dress for women, including the prayer covering. My sister, who joined the church at 13, did you ever wear a covering to Warwick High School?
Not to school. I wore it to church then, but
Yeah.
not to school.
Yeah. So she's 10 years younger. I have one that's 7 years younger, and neither one of them had the same experience because when they went to school, they didn't wear a prayer covering. Then you didn't have this visible sign of your religion on your head. So all of these things were changing, and each one of us lives in a particular slice of history. And if you were born in the middle of a certain wave of change, that's one experience. If you were born at the cusp, the very beginning of one, it's another experience. And if you were born at the tail end of another, that's a very different experience. We see that in politics. We see that in any ongoing history of a people. And so when you look at your life, you ask the question, where am I in the context in which I was raised? Where am I in the context of my family? And I promise you will discover things you didn't know before, and they will make a difference in how you think about yourself. Yes?
What happened to your cover?
I still have it. I have 2 coverings. As the church no longer required it, I no longer wore it. but it took some years while that change was taking place. But it's interesting that even though I was quite happy not to wear it anymore, and I didn't want to wear it when I was in the 6th grade and I knew it would separate me from my classmates, I couldn't burn a covering. I couldn't throw it in the waste can. I imagine I did when I was buying a new one, but if it was the last one, I actually saved it. So I have 2 coverings folded up as they were.
I was speaking more figuratively than physically.
Okay. What happened to the covering
When did
symbolically?
when-
In the church or in my life? I think by choosing to read Romans 12:2 about nonconformity, I would say that I have internalized some of that difference. Even though you don't see a covering on my head, there is kind of one there. It's still, I have enough of that experience and enough of that belief and experience of respect for those who choose to make a statement with their external clothing, that they are committed to something that is higher than the powers of this world. And I believe that whether I'm wearing the covering or not. Yes.
How about women's leadership in the church as far as pastor?
Yeah.
I know some churches have, I don't know about the Mennonites church, but.
Well, it's in the process of change. When I currently attend a Mennonite church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, that has a woman pastor and a woman assistant pastor, co-pastor, and a man who is the youth pastor. Now that's a heavy women leadership component, and it didn't happen overnight. It happened through slow changes as people began to re-examine passages in the Bible, read them less literally than they did before, and ask the question of, are we overlooking the gifts of women, the God-given gifts of women in our midst? And so I believe there are women who have been ordained in the Lancaster Conference. Is that true? True. But it's not common here, more common among Mennonites in some other parts of the country. And that's another thing I thought about. If I had been called to ministry rather than to education, there would have been a difference. Because there isn't any Bible verse that says women should be silent in the classroom. And women have been leaders in education for a long time. And that's true in Mennonite education as well as others. Now, it's not true that women were college presidents very often, but they did play many leadership roles in education before they played them in the church, at least in the pulpit. You have to qualify everything. Yes.
I'm thinking of the insightful, wonderful book, Leaning, I'm referring
Yes.
to.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard women in leadership, or who were in leadership, either way, tell me that when they've been in groups where there are decisions being made, and other leaders, that they will say something, and it will kind of die there. And 15 minutes later, a man will say the very same thing or a similar thing, and suddenly it's a great idea.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you've had that kind of journey at all.
I've seen that. One of the things that women can do, if there are 2 women in the group, look for this and be sure to give recognition to the idea of the first woman speaker, if you're the other woman in the room. Look for it and back up the woman in a very gracious way, of course. I really appreciated Peggy's point. And then make sure Peggy gets credit and everybody sees that it was Peggy's point. So it does happen, and but there are things that you can do. There are actually things if you're the only woman in the room. Sometimes you have to decide, is this worth making a statement about publicly? Or what are my other options? Maybe I could talk to this person behind the scenes so that neither he nor I have to be publicly involved in a discussion of this matter. And maybe we've had a good trusting relationship before and there's like, oh, wow, I did that, didn't I? Maybe, it happens. People can see and change. Maybe you're going to get resistance, but by giving the person a private opportunity to face it, and then you know what you're dealing with too. And then maybe at future times you may or may not publicly confront a behavior if it's persistent and kind of obvious.
Well, usually it's unintentional.
Well, yes. Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is
Yeah.
a good idea, new idea, but it's a group that didn't pick up on the woman.
Right.
But it's a group that picked up
Yeah.
on the man.
And it's a question of being visible. It's a question of whether that woman and her voice was heard and she was visible saying the thing. And if she hasn't been visible, it can be very unintentional, very unconscious, and women can do it too. It's, we can all do this. So it's behavior that's been documented. And yet I think I've seen it change too. I think there are more women in the meetings I'm in. There are more people aware of this as a problem, and there are more people monitoring their own behavior and saying, we're all here together, and we each have a voice, and we each have a role to play, and let's make sure everybody gets the opportunity and gets credit. Thanks. Yes.
I just have a general question about when in the formative years, I'm sure you have a deep Mennonite identity,
Mm-hmm.
and how would you compare yourself with other children, teenagers, privilege or
Did you hear the question back there? I'm sure you had a deep Mennonite identity. And how did you feel vis-a-vis the other children and teenagers who were not Mennonite? And did you feel that you were privileged or that you were the opposite of that? I think I felt this from first grade on. I really do talk about that a lot in the book, how before I went to school, I didn't know I was Mennonite. I just thought I was a person, a human being, and that everybody went to church, and everybody's mother wore a covering on her head, and cape dresses, and you went, you just, that was what life was, made up of Mennonites. But when I went to first grade, I already noticed the difference and sometimes I envied the other little girls, and I especially envied any attention the teachers seemed to be paying to them because of something they had that I didn't have, like a pretty dress or Dale Evans lunchbox, or it could be anything. When you go out on the playground, what do? Well, you play the Alpo commercial from last night on Lassie. So those were things that either made me feel included or not included. But at a deeper level, and as I grew older, I felt comfortable among my friends because, interestingly enough, when you spend a lot of time with somebody else and they happen to be wearing a covering on their heads, and you know that they don't go to the dances, and you know certain things about them, but there are whole swaths of other things that you have in common, and you can really become good friends. And so I did. I became good friends with a number of non-Mennonite schoolmates, and occasionally envied them. Sometimes I was glad, when they would come back to school with stories of who was drunk on the weekends and various things that were going on outside of school. I actually, even then, I felt kind of glad I didn't have to deal with that. I wasn't in social environments where I would have to say no to things I didn't want to do because everybody else was doing it. Now, other times I envied the people because I wanted to do things they were doing. It went both ways. It actually, like I said before, as I look at it now, being forced to be different at a time when everybody wants more than anything else to belong and to be like other people, there's nothing wrong with that, and it did not harm me in any long-term way, and did me a lot of good in some other ways.
I think that we'll conclude. One more question.
All right, this will be the last one.
Hi, I arrived a few minutes late, so I might have missed this, but I'm curious if your desire to write a memoir came gradually. Did it come and then go away? Did it come and then go away? How did you sit with that? And did it happen over a period of time, or did you start to write and then say, hey, I'm going to...
Yeah, a great question. And I never articulated wanting to write a memoir while I was actually being influenced in that direction without knowing it early. I taught expository writing, a class at Goshen College for many years, and it had one section on the personal essay. And that was the section that I always enjoyed the most when we read the essays in the class, and I enjoyed grading the papers the most as compared to the thesis paper, the 500th thesis paper on why I think capital punishment should be abolished or something like that. Those papers never had the same passion. The personal essay is something the student could write from and engage with their whole being, and many of them could write much better when they wrote personal essays. So I began writing personal essays. And in the 80s and 90s, I published a number of personal essays, really enjoyed them, had the benefit of getting critique from some really good writers. And then when I finally had time to write, after I left my last job at the Fetzer Institute, and I loved reading memoir, I began to think about, well, I've kind of been writing memoir all along. Maybe I could put this together, and maybe I could write a memoir, and maybe people would be interested. Maybe Mennonites would be interested, and maybe other people would be interested in the kind of life that I lived, in what it was like to grow up on a sustainable 100-acre dairy farm, which is something that is disappearing on the face of this earth. And to grow up Mennonite during this particular time, in this particular place, when it had these particular rules and regulations and opportunities. So that began to influence me. I started a blog called 100 Memoirs, where I was going to read 100 before I wrote mine, which I actually did. I didn't review all 100, but I read at least 100 memoirs before I wrote my own, based on advice from another writer. And then I went to Herald Press and said, I think I might have a book here. And then we started talking. They gave me a book contract, and 2 years later, she was born. Thanks.